Welcome to Broadcast Interrupted. I'm Chirag.
And I'm Andy.
Who did we interrupt on this week's episode, Andy?
On this week's episode, we interrupted Avijit Mukul Kishore. Mukul is a filmmaker and a cinematographer based in Mumbai. He works mostly within the documentary genre. But something very particular about his work is that he works with people from various different walks of life. And they're an integral part of how he conceptualizes his film projects. Some of his films are Nostalgia for the Future, Electric Shadows, Squeeze Lime in Your Eye, Lovely Villa, and as a cinematographer, I think Kali Salwar and Old Dog's Diary, and quite a few others. The list is quite exhaustive.
Yeah. For us to have him on the podcast was basically to inquire the nature of this line of inquiry into interdisciplinary film practices. For example, he discusses with us on the podcast Electric Shadows, this film that he made for a film festival in China where Indian films were screened. And he discussed and we were able to kind of unpack what is the impact of film on both these cultures. What role does film play when it comes to the politics of history and memory?
Yeah.
And also just the act of documentary filmmaking, really. And I think that was really interesting. And for people who are fans of both architecture and films, I think Nostalgia for the Future is a must-watch. Because in this film, you can see his critique on Indian modernism and on just narratives of nation building that were constructed post-independence in India. I think one of your concerns was also the way he represents reality, or he talks about the representation of reality.
Yeah, and it came out really well during the course of our conversation on the podcast. What I mean by that is probably Mukul seems extremely concerned with how reality can be understood and perceived, not just by the masses. As a film educator himself, he is extremely concerned with how cinema, whether feature or documentary across genres, attempts to reproduce or represent reality, whether it be of the present times or across film archives.
Yeah. This episode will be released in 2 parts, just like all our other episodes. Relevant links to Mukul's work will be found in the description box below. Make sure to check out all the films that he has made as well. Apart from that, we would just like to request you to like, share, subscribe, and most importantly, below the description box, in that small comments box below, let us know what you think. Thanks.
See you on the other side. Ciao. Thank you for joining us on Broadcast Interrupted, Mukul. We're really happy to have you. Chirag and I have been discussing your films and your work, and of course also anecdotally, because Chirag happens to know you from his time at Kamala Raheja Architecture School. And we were thinking this would be a great way to get to know you a little bit better and share, and when you share with us what you think.
Thank you for having me over, guys. And yes, I remember those days of teaching at Kamla Raheja very clearly. I also remember that Chirag was very keen on being an actor. So it was fun. It was great fun, So
Yeah. This
He still
podcast
is.
is yeah, this
yeah,
podcast is
I'm sure.
opening up Pandora's box that I don't really wish to be wish to have opened. But let's go ahead.
Okay,
Great.
there we go.
Okay. Yeah. First things first. What are you currently working on? And then, as a filmmaker, what does when you're in the middle of a project, what does a typical day look like for you?
Okay. What I'm currently working on is I'm trying desperately to restart projects that were held up because of COVID. And yeah, there have been false starts. There have been, things getting stuck, as you know, in our lives in the last 1 year or so. But you spoke to Rohan sometime back, Rohan Shiv Kumar.
Right.
Yeah.
And I must say that the last 5 years have been quite productive for me as a filmmaker and for the two of us as collaborators, where there have been a lot of films that have been coming out one after the other, you know. And much of these reflect our own on our respective practices. Me as a filmmaker, one who likes to dabble in teaching. Rohan as an academic, an architect, and you know, film writer, co-director, and so on. And it's been very invigorating. It's been very nice. And a film that we made together, Nostalgia for the Future, which got completed in 2017, we like to call it our mid-career anxiety. Not a midlife crisis, but a mid-career anxiety, because we're both reflecting on our respective work as to what do I do as a documentary filmmaker? What is the place of my work? Does it ever achieve anything? What are we doing? What is our gaze? We give ourselves a lot of power while speaking on behalf of other people, as documentary filmmakers have done,
Mhm.
as
Right.
filmmakers do. You speak on behalf of other people. And so the film is a reflection on many of those things. I mean, me as a filmmaker, Rohan as an architect, and somebody that provides housing and builds cities for people to live in,
Mm-hmm.
and creating histories in the process, and so on. So a lot of reflection has been happening, through films and even otherwise. And currently, we are trying to restart a project like which I mentioned has been stuck on festivals and celebrations all across the country that are either dying out or transforming very rapidly. So it's a
Ah.
research and documentation project which is a little open-ended at present, and we're hoping to look for patterns. We're hoping to look for agents of those change, and what exactly is driving you know these very popular mass events, and how they've been changing over time. So, so there are a few thoughts, a few threads that we are working on at present. And as soon as we're able to travel, because we're looking at events and festivals across geographies, across faith, across languages and
Mm-hmm.
cultures. So it involves a lot of travel. So we just have to figure out when it's safe to do it again. And
Right.
festivals, by definition, mean crowds. So
Absolutely.
we have to take all that into account, and yeah, that's what we're working on. So, and as you know, a day in the life of a filmmaker for the last 1 year has been pretty much like this, sitting in front of a computer. But otherwise, it's a bunch of things. I mean, it's a lot of pre-production when you're working on something, a lot of research. You might be doing it on your own. You might have a team, and yeah, when you're on a shoot, it's a different story altogether. But otherwise, it's, I guess we live our lives pretty much in front of screens of different kinds. You're
Mm.
either watching things, or you are interacting like this, or you're teaching, or you're editing, and then you're sitting in front of a screen again.
Again.
So that has
Yeah.
become our life. Yeah, so you just change places, you change computers, you could be watching things on a mobile, and so on. So that's, yeah, um, largely it.
Uh,
Largely.
can you tell us a couple of the festivals that you're examining through that project, like the ones which are about to say die out, like you said, or still in the process of?
Still in the process, really. But,
Hmm.
just to name some, um, we're hoping to go to Imphal, Manipur, in the
Mm-hmm.
northeast, and which has a strong Vaishnav tradition of celebrating Holi.
Oh.
Because Vaishnavism is something that got there as recently as 200 years ago, or Hinduism got there about 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been rapidly transforming, and the festivals that are actually becoming less and less prevalent are the more tribal festivals,
Mm-hmm.
of nature worshipping or animistic communities. And as Hinduism becomes more and more mainstream, starts out in a way which itself transforms as patronage changes, whether
Mm-hmm.
financially or politically. And I mean, we say we're a secular country and so on, but we know that religion has always had a role to play in politics, regardless of who was in power. And now even more so, where religion and politics are supposed to be separate, but they're not at all. So looking at those
Right.
processes, really, it's not really meant to be, um, I guess, a critique of a political party or anything, because that's easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at deeper trends, at how society itself changes over time. You
Mm-hmm.
know, based on many factors, and what are the factors that are driving that. So there's that. There's also a project that Rohan had done with his students at Kamala Raheja College for Architecture, where they had mapped the entire Braj region in western Uttar Pradesh, which is
Mm-hmm.
Mathura, Vrindavan, Gokul, Govardhan, the entire landscape where Krishna is said to have, spent his years as a child and as a youth before, he moved on from there. And looking at the entire role of one stories and myths, and how you imbibe something with life, and and it begins to have meanings which again transform and change over time. So that's a project that they had done, where it was a fabulous exhibition they made at the end of it. So that actually is, I guess, more ready. We have to go and start filming. The
Mm-hmm.
one in the Northeast is something that we are going to research as we shoot. So the approaches to the two regions are different. We don't yet know whether that's one film or it's two separate films. So and also it's a long term project. So it'll take a few years before it takes shape, really.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's somehow really unique, at least for us, that you a lot of your work is begins with an exchange with, for example, Rohan, and I'm sure others who are outside of your discipline, formally speaking. And especially with what you mentioned about Brudge, it almost sounds like you are going to refer to architectural drawings to
Yeah.
decide how you're going to film this. And how does that work? Who are you exactly talking to, and how do these discussions work for you?
Yes, I mean, that has a stronger architectural base to start with at present, because it's coming out of a project done by students of architecture.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, and you should have a look at that exhibition, it's online, the drawings are
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
It's these long vertical panels which are referring to traditions of scroll painting
Mm-hmm.
and miniature painting. And so if you're looking at the map of a place, it's referring to a lot of traditions of representation, where it's very beautiful, it's very interesting. It's where the same surface mixes up plan and elevation,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
there are multiple stories and possibly even multiple temporalities that are happening within the same panel. uh, so if one uses things like that, if really one uses things like that, that was for the architectural presentation. But this one, I mean, definitely we are looking at, I guess, the many mixes that happen between traditional painting, between, I guess, cartography, and different modes of representation.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if you look at my work, it's I I like to very freely borrow from other disciplines, whether it's visual art, architecture, music, and
Mm-hmm.
of course, archival film material, things that other people have done before us, and it becomes a reference. You use a reference, whether from visual art, architecture, or film, and by using a reference, you are opening up different histories altogether. You're expanding the scope of what you're doing by
Mm-hmm.
using a reference, by making somebody else's work your own, and using it for the meaning it has, but also the context in which you use it adds other meanings to it, and that itself adds meanings to your work. So it's something that fascinates me. It's something that really fascinates me.
But to clarify, it's not. It doesn't seem like a pursuit of some kind of novelty or newness, is it? That something from the past, something that somebody else has done, made as a work, to be presented in a newer context and to imbibe it with other meanings. Is it? Would you call it a pursuit of some kind of novelty that you have, or is it more nuanced?
Both, because novelty, newness is essential to me. It's
Mm.
absolutely essential to me, and it's something that I loosely tell my students. When I'm looking at their work, is that either show me something completely new, or be bloody good at what you do. You know.
Right.
So of course, that's rhetoric. You're pushing
Right.
Absolutely.
them to
Yeah,
do
yeah.
things in a certain way, and you know that it's difficult to make work. But just to maybe chabi them a little, say,
Hmm.
be original or be bloody good at your work. You know.
Mm.
But so doing something new and breaking new ground with film language is something that is essential to me. And I feel that, we are stealing from others all the time anyway. All of us are. All
Right.
of us are
Mm-hmm.
stealing from others all the time anyway, consciously or maybe not so consciously, because everything that you have learned, everything that you have studied, and, everything that's a part of your experience becomes a part of your being,
Hmm.
and you draw from it anyway. You draw
Mm.
from it, and it's not about plagiarism. It's something that exists there for you, and you make it your own, and you turn it around to make something original. So it's, even if you're using a reference,
Hmm.
it's the context you put it to
Yeah.
that defines whether it's original or whether it's stealing. you know
Right.
Yeah.
Um, how do you go about from, for example, with Nostalgia for the Future, there was a lot of found footage that you've used and extensively also spoken about in your interviews and in your talks. How do you go about navigating an archive? And in this case, I guess, especially, what's it like? What's the films division archive like? Is it mostly works that the films division has commissioned? Here we are asking as complete
Yeah.
novices. We have no idea what it looks like inside, and we're imagining it as a building with library like features and qualities. But what's it like inside, and is it works only that the films division has commissioned, or is it works by other authors? Is it more like a collection? And what do you think when you step into the building, and what are you thinking? How do you go about looking around for found footage?
See, it's something that's played a very significant part in, I guess, shaping me as an
Hmm.
individual, whether it's films division or state television, Doordarshan, or All India Radio.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was growing up, these were the only means of broadcasting, where
Mm-hmm.
television, radio, and documentary film were owned by the state, were made by the state. And it was only in the early 90s that you started having private broadcasters coming in. So it's something that's so much a part of my memory, of growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, and also looking back at it, I'm very conscious of the fact of being shaped by all of it, not just me, everybody around me, of being shaped by it. And I'm going to digress a bit and come back to your
Sure.
question in a bit.
Yeah.
Where I grew up in Delhi and I studied in Delhi, and you realize that Delhi was the at the center of nation building.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being the capital. And when I went to school, if you had music class, the music class by definition meant you were either singing nation building songs or you were singing devotional songs, but these were devotional songs of a very inclusive secular nature.
Mm.
It was about multiple faith, about different communities working together. And when you thought about it, you thought how boring, because when you're in school, you're listening to other things outside, talking about a time. And I think, to a great extent, people still think that film music is cheap, or you should be listening to what it means to be cultured is to be listening to classical music or classical dance and so on. But
High art.
high art, low art, yeah, high art, low art, and so on. um, I just realized what was being done, and we were being programmed in a certain idea of citizenship, you know.
Mm.
And it was very different when I came to Bombay after Delhi, because Bombay did not have that baggage. Bombay really did not have that baggage, which Delhi did, and Delhi continues to have, you know. So when I talk about films division, it's something I look at with a great deal of respect. Now, let me just say, you might not be knowing that when they made their documentary films, there were films of different kinds. There were films that were, of course, recording and informing the citizen about what was going on in the country in terms of government projects, and in terms of self-reliance, in terms of infrastructure building, in terms of social attitudes and problems and so on. There were other films that were instructing you to being citizens of a certain kind, ideal citizens, with certain responsibilities and duties. And there were, of course, the culture films, which would be about different regions,
Mm.
and of course, the music and dance and literature kind of films. Um, so sorry, I lost
I think
thread
you
of what I was
mentioned
going to say.
the types of films that were being made by the films division, and
Yeah,
broadly they seem
yeah,
to be
yeah, yeah.
reform oriented or documenting
Yeah.
ambition of the future, and the third would be a kind of exchange of telling
Yeah.
people from Kerala what's going on in Gujarat, or telling people from Kashmir what's going on in Mumbai, I guess.
Yeah. So, and we're talking about a time when you must remember, this is the only form of film-based news which is coming to you, because television happens much later. Television happens only in the 1980s. Yeah, it happens in the metros through the 60s and 70s, but it goes national only as late as 1982. Films division started in 1948.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a time when the only film-based news or documentary that's coming to you is coming through films division, and these films would be screened before the main commercial feature. When you go out to watch a movie in a commercial theater, you'd have to watch a 10 or 20-minute film before that. Most of the time it was dreadfully boring. You didn't pay for that. You didn't pay for that. You didn't sign up for that. And you don't need to know about fertilizers in Punjab while you're sitting in Tamil Nadu or something. But it's also something that, unfortunately, I guess to a great extent, gave documentary a bad name. Because you didn't sign up for this, and you didn't want to watch this. But it's interesting how we were being constructed in a certain mold at that point of time. There's much to critique there. There's really much to critique there. But there is a certain imagination behind that of trying to build a nation in a certain image, and there's much also that's hugely respectable about it.
Right.
So when you go to a place like Films Division, of course, it's like any other sarkari office, but it has that air of cinema. You can smell celluloid. I don't know if you've heard filmmakers wax eloquent and get very romantic and sentimental about it, that film archives have this certain smell. Unfortunately, that particular smell of vinegar of celluloid film prints is that of decaying film. Because so it's not a good smell to remember film by. But
Right.
any organization that worked with film, their vaults and their archives and their editing rooms always had that vinegary kind of smell, which I think used to get people high, but actually it's the smell of decay. It's the smell of decaying film. Cellulose triacetate, and which would turn into acetic acid or something. And that's what you smell as vinegar. So so there's that hawa of film. And you must realize that, of course, it's hugely bureaucratic, but there are people who've made film all their lives. There are
Right.
qualified professional filmmakers, many of them formally trained at film school, many of them trained on the job or in various other organizations, various other government organizations as well. And what they have in the archive over there is only their work, you know,
Mm.
or work that they may have acquired and distributed
Okay.
because they were in charge of distribution of documentary.
Mhm.
So there's a fairly straightforward way of accessing their archive where you can get there and on their servers they have thousands of films which are fairly well indexed, so you can search by keyword, you can search by year, by director, and so on, and watch them for free over there.
Oh,
They
okay.
have a YouTube channel, which they keep updating. And so a lot is available online, but unfortunately, those copies are not always great or subtitled, you know.
Ah, okay.
So you really have to know what you're looking for, to be able to use that YouTube channel. And of course, you can buy DVDs from them,
Ah,
for your own research work. If you're lucky enough to have access to their catalog, you can do keyword searches, and then it becomes easier to identify what you want to get from them and order them. It's fairly straightforward. It's really fairly straightforward. So that's what it is. And I was fortunate enough to have been part of a team that curated a program of documentary film
mhm.
uh, hosted by Films Division, which was called FD Zone, which
Yeah.
Ah,
ran
okay.
Yeah.
from 2012 to 2015 for 3 years, and I was part of the team that ran that in Bombay. It was a weekly program, so it was one a lot of work and also a lot of energy because it was a weekly program, you
Right.
know.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot
And
of
it was
production.
very, very nice. Yeah, it was very, very nice because we were completely free to screen whatever we wanted along with one Films Division film. So it could be an hour long FD film or a 1 minute FD film.
Uh-huh.
But you try and create a conversation between an independent film from outside, from India or abroad, and one film made by Films Division or more, or periodically have festivals of films.
Mhm.
So the program had great energy. It really had great energy. So it was, yeah, it's something. It's a history that I'm quite close to and respect.
Right.
Of
Yeah.
course, like I said, there's much to critique in there as well,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of propaganda, in terms of like that act of molding a citizen is something which is very, very layered and has to be looked at critically. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a kind of a self-reflective relationship with the film's television archive and the works that are present there.
And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I think what is very interesting is the kind of at the start of talking about the films division, you mentioned the way these categories or how you read into those categories, and I think that's very interesting to start looking at. If we are looking at the molding of a citizen, what are the categories in which we should be making films so that the message comes across, and how do you build on those kind of categories? Like, I think you mentioned that there is uh, a, a, one category where they try to inform people of the life of the citizens in another state, you know and then if I am, say, living in Maharashtra, I can look at that film and really think about, oh, the citizen in the Indian in Kerala constructs himself, and this entire not, or at that point not realizing that actually even this image that I'm seeing is completely a constructed category of uh, sort of projection,
Layers of representation. I
layers
guess.
of representation coming in.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of, in the process, there's a lot of oversimplification as well that happens. A lot of generalization, a lot of oversimplification, and a sense of Orientalism that plays out, where our relationship with the Northeast is hugely problematic. The very
Yeah.
fact that we refer to 7 states as Northeast,
Yeah.
which again are extremely diverse and a mix of different kinds of cultures, from the influence of different arms of the church, and tribal groups and different forms of Hinduism, then influences from Burma, from Thailand, from China, from Tibet, and so on. Everything. And to put it under one umbrella called the Northeast is problematic, is hugely problematic. But yeah, I mean, in the absence of anything else, if I need a ready reckoner on Manipur, then I could just pick up a film and watch how it's been represented, maybe in 1957 or something, or
Yeah, yeah,
later.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I have welcomed very greatly one great experiment in India, which you know very well, Chandigarh. Many people argue about it. Some like it, some dislike it. It is totally immaterial whether you like it or not. It is the biggest job of its kind in India. That is why I welcome it. It is the biggest because it hits you on the head, because it makes you think. You may squirm at the impact, but it makes you think and imbibe new ideas. And the one thing that India requires in so many fields is to be hit on the head so that you may think. Jawaharlal Nehru.
I have two things. One, these are kind of random actually, but two things. I love the fact that the films division started in 1948, and our constitution came after that. And the second is, I guess, with the Northeast, especially with your own collaboration with Rohan, that you guys have this sort of extended interest in the Northeast of India. Isn't it quite a, the term itself, the Northeast of India, the Seven Sisters or the Seven States? Isn't it quite a geopolitical term more than one that is referring to any kind of cultural difference per se?
Yes and no,
Ah.
because depends on who's using it and how,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, in one sweeping statement, if, let's say, one talks about, okay, Nehru had a slogan called unity in diversity,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
where you are unified with and respect your diversity and so on. But very often you realize that it's often that idea of unity means uniformity and not necessarily diversity.
Mhm.
And we're not necessarily referring to the present times. It's something where you've seen this happen. I mean, you've seen this happen regardless of which party was in power, you know. And the kind of divisions of region, of language, of who gets to call himself or herself a valid citizen, and we've seen it all around. We've really seen it all around as to how people, especially people in positions of power, treat people who might belong to a minority community or come from what is called a lower caste, and so on.
Yeah.
So geopolitical, I agree, but very often it's just used very loosely. Very
Right.
very loosely, where you can make sweeping statements like Kashmir se Kanyakumari or Assam se Gujarat. So yeah, now we go further east than Assam,
Yeah, yeah.
Arunachal and so on. But
Yeah.
so yes, one has to be careful of how one uses those terms. But then again, if you're talking about propaganda, and propaganda is hugely problematic. The
Right.
propaganda only works when you talk in oversimplifications. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
so it's something that one needs to understand. One really needs to understand, and there are times when uh, I guess people give in. And I'm talking about people who, we've seen it happen in the recent years where, people whom we would call highly educated, rational and scientific and so on. And at some point, people just gave in, to mainstream media or to propaganda on the social media. And it's become very difficult to talk to people, really very difficult to talk to people in the present day. So you figure out, you really figure out how you're going to deal with it. So
Right.
I'm not sure what the baggage of the British Public Works Department or military cantonment ideas that was inherited subconsciously by the new Public Works Department, but I suspect there's something of that. The cantonment had established a kind of environmental paradigm of order, of openness, and of all provisions carefully made and maintained by an authority.
One of the things about modernist architecture and planning projects is that they imagine a society that's free from the past. I will not look at caste, I will not look at class, etc. Does that actually happen?
Not really. I mean, in that sense, the government has very strict hierarchy. The whole definition of type 1 to type 5, it's almost like giving out housing as per the rank you occupy within the government machinery. And that had a precursor in the New Delhi plan. So the whole size of the plot, the location of the plot was all depending upon the rank you occupied in that hierarchy.
Yeah.
Coming to how, actually going with what you just said, and to try and understand whether propaganda is predetermined and predetermined and then constructed, or somehow takes shape as a larger sort of set of pointers that are set into motion across the nation. How do you see the discipline and the formal aspects of documentary filmmaking versus journalism? And I will leave you to sort of pick what format of journalism would you want to compare your own
If any.
discipline to, if any, whether it be news presenting or journalistic documentaries or the written form, or please, as you wish.
I'd start by saying there's as much diversity in the field of journalism as there is in the field of documentary. Where you might say that I guess majority of journalism would be topical, would be dealing with topical subjects, in terms of reporting them, analyzing them, critiquing them, getting opinions on them. And documentaries don't necessarily have to do that in the present day, because it's also complicated, because journalism these days, by definition, has started meaning live,
Right.
So you report things as they're happening, even when you don't know very much about it. It's not recent, it's 20 years old by now, this form of journalism where this entire monster called breaking news, where you just get people worked up. You just get people excited when you have very little information coming in. And sometimes 100% of what you say is based on conjecture, is based on guesswork, is based on just building up people's passions about something you so far know nothing about or very little about. So that's the monster that actually even old-fashioned journalism is right now dealing with. And it's created a kind of crisis in documentary filmmaking, because if you are talking about documentaries that were supposed to comment on things which journalism was talking about in a certain way, where, let me be more specific, like I said, if Films Division was responsible for giving you film-based news and reports and current events, it was a state's version. It was a state's version of writing its own history, which was by definition propagandist. Now, if I look at it as somebody who is interested in archives, I would say this is the state writing its own history. It's and history by definition is subjective,
Right.
Yeah.
So it is their own point of view which they're seeing, and the critique of it is for us to make. And what started happening in the mid 1970s was that Anand Patwardhan, as an independent filmmaker, followed by many others later, started making independent documentaries, which were looking at telling you the other side of the story, which the state by no means would ever tell you. So it was critical. It was showing you other things. It was in many ways trying to tell you, within quotes, the truth behind state propaganda, or the other side, of the actual truth, which the state would never tell you, and so on. But then, as you can understand, there was a certain production cycle that these films had to go through, and it took time to make them. Now, in the day and age of breaking news and live news, that act of documentary filmmaking can't catch up. It really can't catch up, and it's also it serves a different purpose, really. It really serves a different purpose, where if you're making something that's long form, or if you're making something that's critical of either current events or their representation, by the time your film is ready, the news cycle has moved way ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
So which is where I think that kind of filmmaking is in some ways some kind of crisis. But it is important, nevertheless, to make that record and make that intervention of making your film and letting it be, for people to watch and maybe get the other side of the story. But coming back to the difference between journalism and documentary, this is what I guess has been mainstream documentary for a long time. Where the alternative also becomes mainstream at some point,
Okay.
where what is considered documentary by definition meant something which is talking about a social issue, which is talking about a certain social problem, which is critiquing the state. And there are so many different other forms of expression that the nonfiction medium has always seen, whether in India or abroad. And in India, it's seen very, very specific moments of expression, which is either political or either, let's say, majorly commenting on a strong political subject or a theme. But the tone it chooses to do that is different. The tone it chooses to do that is maybe subversive, maybe nuanced, maybe quieter, maybe gentler. And I'm not, going with the cliche that everything is political.
Right.
I'm saying that your films can have any kind of subject or any kind of theme. And there's been, again, a huge diversity of films made in the non-fiction medium in India for a very long time now. And interestingly, starting with Films Division in the late 1960s, where there was a period where they needed to shake off the image of being propagandist, of being dull and boring, and so on. And under the leadership of a person called Jean Bhavanagri, who was from UNESCO, and encouraged filmmakers working within the organization to experiment with filmmaking, experiment with film form, be critical of the state as much as the state would allow, and also It really empowered. It really empowered filmmakers because you just realized what they were capable of. You realized what they were capable of, and the work that happened in films division at that time was extremely original, and in many cases still remains unprecedented in terms of both an exploration of film form and also in terms of how a scathing critique of the state was coded within film language. Those films make for an incredible study, um, which I think has really started happening only recently. People have looked at it earlier, and and under the lens of experimental film. But I think to look at the political message behind that experimentation in film is something that's only started happening in the last 5 or 10 years or so. There's really lots there. And it was in the 90s where people started looking at other themes, other subjects, other ways of filmmaking. And finally, it was the coming of digital technology where you move away from celluloid based film production, which completely freed people up, because film was expensive, film was tedious, and apart from production, exhibition became much easier, because you didn't need to carry a film reel, you didn't need to carry a film projector to places or be tied up to venues that had all those facilities. So, I must say the last 25 years in the history of Indian documentary have been very, very vibrant.
Yes.
And there's a lot of very original work that has happened at the hands of filmmakers who could be as senior and eminent as Kamal Swaroop, in terms of the films that he has made, and much junior first-time filmmakers as well. So I think it's been a very interesting time.
It has taken, from what we gather now, from what you've said, it has always taken documentary films. Filmmaking. Has always taken some sort of a reaction. I know the word is a bit loaded these days, but it has reacted to different flavors of events. So, for example, you mentioned a change with Jean Bhavanagri in the late 60s, or with Anand Patwardhan in the mid 70s, which sounds to me around the emergency time, and also something that was immediately after, as I've read or been told, immediately after a moment of triumph for India, because that decade is always, the 70s decade is always said to be one that had very sharp ups and downs.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag
for the social.
Yeah.
Also, announcing that we now have nuclear missiles, and Indira Gandhi absolutely championing certain other, let's say, ambitions on the nation scale during that time. So documentary filmmaking has always had this in common with journalism, that it has reacted, of course, through long form, but it has reacted to different flavors of events that the nation has experienced, and it has produced different types of subversive or encouraging, or I don't know, complementary, or different types of agendas, let's say. Is that something that you personally study or reflect on? Is that something would I guess also what I'm trying to ask is, what do you want to react to today?
Okay, so now you're right about that. You're right about that. Where I would say that if we are looking at, let's say, the state making films, the state itself is not a monolith. you
Right.
know, where there are different people where given the slightest chance, you can be taken by surprise as to how much things can change under one visionary leader
Mhm.
who has the backing of the system or who knows how to work the system, you know. Um, and things can completely change. Likewise, even among independent filmmakers, there are filmmakers of all kinds, really, you know,
Mhm.
of different political alignments, of different ways of looking at film and looking at different audiences, really, you know. So, for me, it becomes interesting to look at that entire process of looking at work, whether it's coming from the state or from the independent filmmaker, which is reflecting on and also trying to construct an image of us in a certain mold,
Mhm.
you know. So if the state at some level, you know, was saying and continues to say that we are here to do good for you, and it's your duty to be a certain kind of citizen, you know, for the betterment of society and for the country and so on. Um, the independent filmmaker can also say things like, we understand that the state has given you a raw deal, and we are here to represent the other side of it. Now, both of them, in their own way, are honest, you know, to their brief and to their job. Both of them, in their understanding, mean well. But for me, it's interesting that both the gazes are paternalistic. You know, both of them are trying to say that, look, we are here to make things better for you. And that largely is what Nostalgia for the Future is all about. You know, where you say that you've been represented in a certain way in documentary, or we've made certain houses for you because we imagined what the body of a modern Indian citizen was like, and therefore we'll make houses for you accordingly. You
Right.
know, it's honestly, as a filmmaker, it's something that, you know, I look at, if I can, with some amount of distance. You know, I'd say, okay, this is what this is the mold in which the filmmaker is representing um, his or her subject,
Mhm.
and yeah, and how will it be seen when this issue is not a current topical issue anymore, you know. So which is why it's
In
become
hindsight.
easier in hindsight, you know, it's become easier to look at, for me at least, it's become easier to look at the films division archive, because it's like, okay, this is how you were imagining we'd be uh, in 1965. You know, this is how you were imagining that citizens would be when you were looking at them in 1965, and so on. You know,
I yeah.
yeah.
I think it also decouples this idea of having to then follow the news cycle, no? Like the one that you were mentioning earlier, where there is
Yeah.
a sort of
Velocity to it.
velocity at which you have to keep producing. I'm
Yeah.
also just a little curious as to the scale of the dissemination of the films division of the media that the films division was producing, because you mentioned in one place that it was played in theaters at the start, and then you also said for screening them with carrying cameras and or screens and projectors and going to different places. So could you just talk a little bit about the kind of scale at which this archive was disseminated or has been disseminated, and what is its where does the dissemination currently lie? How do we consume documentary films in today's
In
time?
India.
Like, where do we consume them? What is this site?
So how it worked earlier was, like I mentioned before, you would watch these films in cinema theaters, you know, all over the country. And at the peak of their production, they were dubbing their films into 16 languages, 16 national languages, where,
That's amazing.
Yeah.
yeah, also problematic because you had to turn these around really fast. You really had to turn these around really fast where something happens and you need it screened across the country a week later. And it takes time to do that. It really takes
Right.
time to produce it, which means you'll make it in the simplest way possible. And they would entirely be voiceover and commentary driven, where the commentary is a module, as part of the
Yeah.
film, and you can take it out and you can replace it with commentary in a different language, and it becomes a film in Bangla or Punjabi or Malayalam or something, and not in English or Hindi.
Hmm.
So you realize that there's a lot of essentialization and generalization that's happening in the process. It's news or current affairs in bullet point form, where people get to watch them, or there'd be the entire um, they had this field publicity division where you'd take projectors and screens and sound equipment, and you'd have these vans which would go deep into the interiors, and you'd screen films that are relevant to particular target groups. So you could screen films on relevant to agriculture or public health and screen them in villages, for the people. So somebody would get something out of it. How accessible it was, how audible it was, if suddenly 500 people land up to see it, and so
Yeah.
on. You can imagine. So going from that to various other modes of accessing and engaging with the documentary through documentary circuits where they'd be hosted by public institutions, cultural institutions, educational fora, colleges and schools, and there'd be film festivals, across the country, which still happen. There are organizations that would fund documentary, and they would have their own channels of dissemination through screenings, through film festivals, or through later DVD or online distribution. But at present, it is an enormous crisis because many of these institutions are either not that active anymore or are in the process of shutting down. There's an incredible organization called PSPT, Public Service Broadcasting Trust,
Yes.
which for the last 20 years has been funding documentary films. And I've made 3 or 4 films for them, So they have been very, very instrumental in one supporting and then screening and disseminating documentary. Of course, you can critique any organization and their work, but what they've done in the last 20 years is quite remarkable, is really quite remarkable. And off late, as you all know, in the current climate, it's become not just very difficult, it's become impossible to screen anything which in any way questions or comments on or critiques the current government. So
Or even just sways from praise, right?
sways from
Praise of the establishment. Praise and celebration of the establishment. You don't actually
they'd
have
be
to
happy
say
to do.
anything against them. You just have to
Yeah, exactly. He
not
said
say
it
what they want to
sways.
hear.
If it sways, then it's also considered not possible, right? Like it should stick to that. I think.
Sorry, I know I'm not getting your point.
I'm just saying that it doesn't even have to go as far as saying something against the establishment. Isn't it more a question of just saying something different and not hearing what is familiar?
Oh, absolutely. Because there is no scope for saying anything different at all.
Yeah, because it's not actually what I'm
So-
trying to point out, just to clarify, is that it's not actually a binary. There is that polar opposite doesn't actually exist for me. It's just that if you sway from a particular line, even if you say, but I prefer orange juice and I'm not going to talk about a certain celebratory aspect of what's going on in the news today, you are, you're ignorant from the other side or something. Just not towing the line is enough. You don't even have to go against something.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So it's a place where there's a huge crisis all over again.
Mm-hmm.
There's really a huge crisis where, and of course, they've been leading by example, where you just think many times before saying things on a public forum, and just figure out other ways of maybe getting your point across. But then you're up against an entire industry, really an entire industry that has a huge amount of money and, of course, complete political will behind it at spreading disinformation like crazy, to be very, very kind to the whole process. So,
yeah, it sounds. I actually had this little giggle when you said 16 different languages were used to spread. The way I would like to put it, 16 different languages were applied onto the same set of images, and nobody actually knows what narrative was produced where, and with what kind of emphasis. And to look now how that process seems to have been reversed a little bit, where the diversity in what it saying, dealing with a certain subject in a different language is being played down actively. To go and argue North Indian values, let's say, with somebody in West Bengal or in Chennai, is being played down as, oh, that's not necessary anymore because everyone's on YouTube somehow. And that seems to be quite an interesting point of tension that documentary filmmaking seems to be dealing with in some way.
I mean, documentary filmmaking, if they were earlier dealing with only films division or Doordarshan, I mean, now you're dealing with all the various social media, because that is what you do, and much more than your mainstream news. So just to give you an example, if you are looking at Facebook, if you're looking at their entire, monitoring standards, when you report something as offensive or abusive or anything, they have stronger systems in place when it comes to more mainstream languages. But if somebody is writing in Burmese, and I was reading somewhere that it's being used hugely to not only spread misinformation, but complete, instigating people to, pushing them towards being genocidal. And they don't have the systems in place to monitor those posts. So you become instrumental in being people who carry messages of genocide, because you don't have those teams and those systems in place, where when somebody is writing in a non-mainstream language, then you just don't correct them. And what happens in the process, because everybody is consuming that.
Yeah.
So, and it's happening to a great extent with us as well, because what is happening in all the vernacular, and finally, who has the onus? If you're talking about messages that are coming on family WhatsApp groups or building WhatsApp groups and so on, whom do you hold responsible? You can say that WhatsApp is just a messenger, right? You don't shoot the messenger. But how do you monitor, and how can you ever have an argument on WhatsApp? You can't. So it's what they call the word masterstroke, which has been used very liberally in the last few years. It's a masterstroke. Nobody is responsible. The citizens are responsible for sowing hatred. Nobody is responsible. So
I want to kind of since we've been talking, I think I have a feeling we're sort of now beginning to touch upon also uh, what is the not a completed image, but this whole construction of the Indian citizen that went on since independence. There, of course, it's a, I would say, a vague image of what the Indian citizen is, may be made today. But I want to kind of go, what what would be an intimately seen idea or image of the Indian citizen, or if you may, if you wish, a subaltern subject, or South Asian identity, seen from your perspective. What would you say would be an intimate way to get to know, because you are somebody that works with a camera, and that is something you have to, I imagine, at all times be conscious of.
So what exactly are you asking?
How would you say, I know it's a little bit of a vague question, what would you say is an intimate way to capture what an Indian citizen today may be? I mean, I think I'm referring also to your work a little bit with
Snapshots from a family album.
Snapshots from a family album, uh, where there is one kind of intimacy that is produced by the camera work, with in terms of how close a shot is, or how the sound is, let's say, edited or cleaned up or left with a little bit of noise, uh, versus what the character may or may not be doing. But I'm not sure that is a sort of a at least it was so nuanced and specific that if I were to think of arriving in any city in India today with a camera and wanted to get a shot in the public realm of an intimate idea of what the citizen of that city looks like or feels or behaves like, because we all have these images. I mean, Mumbai walas know what Delhi walas, we have all these cliches and metaphors for each other that that are always in play underneath the surface. How would you go about thinking about something? And I emphasize on the word intimate because I want to see, as a filmmaker, how would you think about capturing something sort of essential in a character?
For me, I would often look for a reference, which becomes a way of approaching a person I don't know. I'll explain that. Where it's very different, from when I'm making a film on my parents, as their son and as a filmmaker. It's very different from looking at a person on the street in a place I know nothing about. Like, we're starting this project in the Northeast, and it's not a place that I have a relationship with. So the gaze is very different. The gaze is very different, and the way of engaging would be very different in each case. What really matters is the intent, to be able to say that there are things that I cannot understand. There are things that I cannot understand here, that I am an outsider, that there will be a certain amount of assumption that goes into making these images because they're coming out of as much or as little I know about this place. So if I become self-reflexive about it, then and also maybe self-critical about it, then that's a more honest way of looking at it than saying, I already know you. And, somebody else might say, oh, we're all humans and we have the same feelings and same emotions and so on. And that, human language is higher than, can transcend linguistic barriers and so on. No. No. I mean, there has to be a different way of framing each subject. And I'll just give you an example of a film that I made in China, which is called Electric Shadows, Journeys in Image Making, where I was part of a film festival, of Indian films and experimental video, which was held in 4 cities in China 10 years ago. And 3 years later, I 3 years later, I visited China to look at that entire act of looking at a culture through the images that we get out of it. So if for somebody who's not visited India, or somebody who's not visited China or any other place, what are the images that are forming your idea of that culture? It's the cinema, it's the popular culture images, it's the music, it may be food, and so on. And of course, our common histories in the case of India and China, political histories and so on, which have always been troubled. So I was looking at how cinema has formed this image for us, where people have a certain idea of India out of Bollywood films. Or if Indians have had a certain idea of China by looking at martial arts films, or a different kind of Indian has an idea of China by looking at the more art house films out of China. So it was really looking at that and trying to frame this entire landscape through images that I have already seen, and creating a kind of interaction which then becomes a critique of how those images of cultures are created. And it's also very funny because Rohan was there, on that film, and we were traveling together, and it's a cliche, but how people might say that people of a certain race all look the same to people of another race, So while we were traveling around, and this is something that has happened to Rohan in both China and Germany, very, very diverse places, where people think he is Shah Rukh Khan because all Indians look like Shah Rukh Khan, right? Okay. So there's a funny sequence in the film where there are these girls at a public place who think he's Shah Rukh Khan and want to take selfies with him. Or the entire essentialization that all Indians sing Mera Juta Hai Japani or Avara Hu, So it's a funny film. You guys should watch it. It's on Vimeo. So it finally becomes, this entire act of trying to say that who am I to speak on behalf of somebody else? I can try to be honest about it. And I can refer to, things such as this. As to, okay, if I'm looking at the Northeast, what is my image of the Northeast? Is it that, people are doing tribal dance all the time, or bamboo dance and playing, and wearing feathers on their heads, which is the Bollywood image of a certain kind of so-called tribal within quotes, So deconstruct that a bit, really deconstruct that a bit. So yeah, it's aware. I mean, for me, it's very, very important to say that I'm aware of the power that I have wielding a camera and trying to speak on behalf of somebody else, and not for a moment thinking that I'm here to do you good. No, that's a problem. That's a problem. Yeah.
Then these are your sort of, we would say, your ethics, the ethics of what you think your discipline should be doing, including you yourself as a part of that larger community of people that do this as their work, as their sort of, as the way of producing meaning, living meaningful lives along with the work that they do. How do you see then, or how do you rather deal with a movie like, let's say, even a nice one like Slumdog Millionaire? I'm assuming as a filmmaker that's a great technically really well done, I guess, for you. But how do you deal with not the production of cliches or the establishment, or not establishment, that's a terrible word for this, but for the confirmation of cliches, or how do we go about rediscovering each other in the world?